Hello, I'm Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico. This is New Mexico History in 10 minutes. Thank you for joining me. I want to recap what I talked about last time. Let's just say that our ancestors were hunters and gatherers in prehistory, before history. They were nomadic, meaning they followed the food. They were at the mercy of nature. And then history begins when our ancestors started to write things down and manipulate their food supply, controlling plants and animals. In the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, they had wheat and barley. In China, rice. And in the Americas, corn. So this is when history begins, when we start to write things down and we start to have communities, cities develop, communities with laws and religion and codes that are written down out of Mesopotamia. We get the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, kind of brutal, but nonetheless, it's the first law that we get. And it's the beginning of what will evolve through the centuries into legal systems and governments that we live in even to this day. So it's very important. I also want to mention that another major ancient civilization develops in Africa, in Egypt, along the Nile River. This is where we start getting some major architecture. All these communities have architecture. They have granaries to hold food, and they also have roads. But it's the pyramids that really show us how our ancient ancestors constructed buildings that were quite impressive. Diets start to change, which means populations start to grow. I mentioned how animals were domesticated: goats, sheep, cows, beasts of burden. Also, how we eat. Imagine milking a goat and then killing a goat or a sheep and storing the milk in the stomach. That's probably how we got cheese, because the various chambers of the animal stomach would coagulate the food or whatever was in there, the enzymes, and our ancestors probably put some milk in there to store it, and eventually it turned to cheese. And somebody said, somebody needs to try that, see if it's any good. And thankfully, one of our ancestors tried it and said, "This is really good, this cheese." And then somebody had the great idea that, well, we need to invent something to drink with this. So our ancestors started fermenting grains and fruits, and things like beer and wine were created. Imagine that. I'm really happy about that. The first writing we have is a cuneiform from Mesopotamia. It's on a clay tablet, and what it seems to be is an accounting record of paying workers with beer. That's a civilization I could get into. Beer wasn't what we have now. It was probably more like a cake or a soup. Nonetheless, it was highly valued and used as currency. So there you go. Very important. What we need to understand, though, is that these civilizations also develop economies, okay? Economics start to become an integral part of civilization and society. So when one group has a surplus of one product, they would trade with another group whatever they might have in surplus. Or we also developed weaponry with bones and wood, and then later on with steel, bronze. So sometimes people would just take what they wanted or take what they needed by force. So we also still have that with us, okay? So these ancient civilizations develop over time, and in the Middle East especially, you get Assyrian civilization, you get the Persians, and Europe all the while is still asleep and evolving with prehistoric people, Celts. They're living much like the prehistoric Native Americans or the people of Africa. But Europe gets her first major civilization with the ancient Greeks. Okay, this is where Western civilization begins, and it's important. The ancient Greeks, they start a few thousand years BC, before Christ, if you're a traditionalist, or BCE, if you're a modernist, before the Common Era. And they are very important because geography helps them develop their civilization. It's a very, very rocky, mountainous terrain. There's agriculture there, the grape and wine. But there's also the development and evolution of city-states, okay? And these are very integral to the development of Europe and Western civilization because of the governments they produce. The two most famous are Sparta and Athens. Sparta is an oligarchy, very military and brutal. 10-year-old boys were taught to be soldiers, and they had to eat blood soup, blood pudding, and very tough. Athens invented democracy. Way back when, they developed democracy. Didn't look quite like what we have. Only certain people could vote, only men, only landowners. But it's important because out of that Greek civilization, we also get things like drama, comedy, and of course philosophy, the search for truth. Sophia, the love of truth. And the big three philosophers that we get out of Greece are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Very important in the development of Western and historical thought. So while these ancient Greeks are developing their philosophy and their economies and their armies and developing new ways of fighting Persia, there are other developments taking place in the Middle East and around the world, and these are religious. There are religious beliefs developing all over the world, and we need to understand that all of our ancestors, just as they started out as hunters and gatherers, they started out as polytheists. Polytheism, that poly meaning many. All of our ancestors believed in many gods. They looked at the stars and thought they were gods. They looked at mountains and thought they were gods. Rivers had spirit. Pantheism is what everybody was believing in the Americas, the Native American people. The Europeans had their nature religions developing. And this was happening all over the world, in Africa and in the Middle East. But in Asia, the oldest systems came out, such as Hinduism, polytheistic, with elements of religious doctrines and practices that look kind of like what you'd see in the Middle East. And after that, out of Hinduism, you get Buddhism. But those are the oldest systems out there. In the Middle East, though, you have the Hebrew people. They're the first to be monotheistic, meaning mono meaning one, meaning belief in one God. That's what they bring to history and to the world. The belief that there's one God operating outside of our lives, controlling, influencing, helping, and sometimes punishing. So we have to look at this development with monotheism in the Middle East, Greek philosophy, and these systems all come into play and mix and blend with development of trade. All these civilizations start to trade, especially from China, Japan, through India, into the Middle East, and then into Europe. This is the Silk Road. This is a system of trade that really is a proto-globalism. It's not the whole world, but still, there's trade going on. Obviously, there's going to be trade going on between all these different communities in Europe and Africa and in the Americas as well. So, I just want to leave you with this idea, this thought about economics driving history, people driving history, wants, needs and desires, hopes and dreams, and out of Greece, philosophy, and out of the Middle East, monotheism, and they'll all come together and create an even newer situation when we get to North Africa and Europe. We will get to New Mexico eventually, but I want you to know about all these different developments in history to help us understand how and why we are where we at today. So that's it for me. Thank you for joining me on New Mexico history in 10 minutes, and I'll see you next time. Adios.